Hello there and welcome to another video, and today we're going to kick off with this 1973 example of a 917-10 Can-Am car from Porsche. This is a Spark model, and this is the version from the 1973 Laguna Seca race with the RC livery driven by George Follmer. It's obviously out of its box here, but it has one of the rather nice American flag Spark boxes, the cardboard outer, which looks pretty nice. George Follmer himself was actually quite successful with this car, but not in 1973, which is when the 917-30 was introduced, and that basically dominated the entire season, being an upgrade and a better version of the 917-10. Follmer had actually won the 1972 championship in the 917-10, taken over from Mark Donohue following a bad accident, and Donohue would later go on to win in the 917-30 in 1973. The car was capable of making 1,000 horsepower in qualifying trim at least, and was just an absolute beast in its day, only being beaten by its direct Porsche replacement, which bumped the horsepower to even more lunatic levels at nearly 1,550 horsepower. The 917 as a model overall, like many of its Porsche brethren at the time, went through a lot of variants, and I'm very happy to have this one in my collection. Next up, we have another vehicle that spent its life tearing up the tarmacs across circuits in America. This model is by Minichamps, and it is of the rather famous and rather awesome Audi 90 Quattro IMSA GTO, which is another silhouette wide body car and successor to the Audi 200 Quattro Trans Am, although the model numbers wouldn't really suggest that. Whilst it's the Audi 90, it actually competed in 1989, and this particular model represents the version that won the IMSA GTO series that year, piloted by Walter Röhrl, who is most well known as a very successful rally driver, and alongside him Hans-Joachim Stuck, who won many different touring car championships and Le Mans, and raced in prototypes and won there also. The car isn't as powerful as the 917-10 that we just saw, but it's still pretty loony, pretty hairy at over 700 horsepower, and just as Audi did in rallying, they proved that the Quattro system was a force to be reckoned with on the track as well. It wasn't really much of a surprise that they won the championship with that awesome driver pairing and the great technology that Audi has. It took me quite a while to find one of these, and I had to pay a pretty penny for it, so I'm very happy to have this one in my collection and display it for you guys here. Now for our next model, we're taking a flight across to Japan for this 1993 version of the R32 Skyline GTR, and this is a Group A car. This is a model of the HKS liveried version from the 1993 Japanese Touring Car Championship made by HPI. This is not the most successful of the R32s in the Japanese Championship, but it is one of the more recognisable liveries because of the HKS oil slick pattern on it, and from reading up about it, this is what they used on their oil cans back in the day. Ultimately, the 1993 championship was won by probably the most famous R32 Skyline, the Panasonic Skyline, and from 1990 through to 1993, the R32 pretty much dominated that championship, winning from what I can see is 29 out of 29 races. Whilst its power figures might not compare to the other models that we've seen in the video, 543 is still a ridiculous amount of power for a touring car, and that really helped to maximise its potential with the four-wheel drive and power pushing it out of the corners, despite the heavier weight that the car carried due to its four-wheel drive system. It didn't just dominate in Japan either, it also was smashing everybody over in Australia, in the Australian Championship at the time, where it was constantly being restricted and hampered, but it still managed to pull through and take victories. And this is what led to it being given the title of Godzilla. Whilst, as noted, this is probably not the most famous of the R32 liveries, it is my favourite, and I'm really glad to have this HPR model in my collection. For the next model in the video, we have this Spark representation of the 962 that isn't a 962 but is really a 962. A little bit of a controversial car. This is the Dauer 962 Le Mans. The Dauer 962 Le Mans competed in the 1994 running of the Le Mans, which this particular version was the winner. It was Porsche's way of getting the 962 back into Le Mans, and they took the opportunity to avoid some of the LMP regulations by running it in the GT1 class. The GT1 class was somewhat more relaxed in 1994, and whilst they did face restrictions on engine power, having to drop the standard road car, which runs at 720 odd horsepower, down to 550 for the Le Mans version, the race car, they were allowed to run larger fuel tanks, which meant they needed to stop a lot less. The outright pace of the Dauer 962 was not quite as high as the LMP1 class cars, but they were absolutely smashing every other car in the GT1 class. And without problems to the second car, they most likely would have had a 1-2 finish, but in the end they finished first and third with the Toyota 94 CV splitting the pair of them. Overall, another nice model by Spark and a nice way to round out my 962 collection. For the penultimate model today, we are taking a leap forward in time right up to 2018 for this BMW M8 GTE or GTLM, depending on how you want to look at it. This model is by TrueScale, and the version represented here raced in the 2018 IMSA Petit Le Mans, and it came in third place in class. This was the Team RLL entry. Of the drivers, the only one I recognise really is Chaz Moster, who's most well known for V8 supercars in Australia, and he's won the Bathurst 1000 a couple of times, being one of the drivers to have actually done that in both a Ford and a Holden, so I'm not entirely sure how his reputation stands down under for that. In terms of the car itself, I particularly remember this being one of the widely memed cars at the time, known as the Wide Boy, due to the size of the car, even though it's not really that much bigger than its predecessor, the M6, and it weighs exactly the same. Over time I've been trying to collect the various different types of cars that BMW ran in the GT3, GT2 and GTE series, and this is one of the key ones to get. I particularly liked the livery in black, and I'm very happy to have this in my collection. And finishing up for this video, we have the Le Mans hypercar, the Glickenhaus 007 LMH. This model is by Spark, and the version that they've made here is a scaled replica of the car that finished 4th in the 2021 Le Mans. Now it's at this point that I need to hold my hands up and say that whilst I'm relatively familiar with modern F1 simply from watching the highlights and keeping track of the Drivers' Championship, I'm not really familiar with modern prototype racers or the WEC. The purchasing of this model came about because I got some vouchers through work that I could use on Amazon, and browsing through the available models on there, this one caught my eye. I've never really been a fan of the modern prototypes, but this one actually really stood out. It's quite an interesting shape, and I'm probably going to go and collect some more Le Mans hypercars in the future. When looking up the details for this video, I was actually quite surprised at the power that the car produces at 670, which is obviously a lot of horsepower, but compared to prototypes of the past, not necessarily that high, as they got to ridiculous levels at some points. And the term hypercar typically conjures up images of 1500 horsepower plus monsters these days. Regardless of performance figures, it's a really cool looking car. I think there's some great details on this one. It's a Spark model, so that's kind of what you'd expect, and it's very intricate, so it will definitely get itself a proud place on my display shelves. And with that, it's the end of this video, the last of the model cars for this one, and I'd like to thank everybody again for watching the video and bearing with me whilst I take the time to make new ones. Hopefully everybody enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.